Last time on Project E. Arresting anyone who showed any form of dissonance. Well, China was having some problems of their own. They were trying to fend off the Chinese Communist Party. This is what happens when none of my friends are available for Saturday. Y'all asked for this. What will we cover next? Stay tuned in to find out. So, do any of you guys know anything about World War II?
Yeah, I know that World War II was a very global conflict. It involved a lot of the world's major powers.
That's why they call it World War II, because it was the Second World War. Did you know that more civilians died in World War II than soldiers? And World War II was also the debut of atomic bombs, which were really devastating.
They led to the end of the war, especially with Japan after being launched on Nagasaki and Hiroshima.
So World War II basically begins when Hitler invades Poland and the Allied forces, they can't take any more of this, so they have to fight back. So France, you know what they're preparing for? They're going to build up a huge line along the French and German border in a disputed territory with a bunch of resources. So they build up this huge military line called the Maginot Line. And you want to know what happened to that line?
So this was essentially like an arms race between Germany and France. France would create different weapons and different defense systems to make sure that Germany wouldn't invade. And Germany would essentially do the same thing. At the same time, even though the wall was really big, they were spending too much time building it, and so there was a hole left in. And so that led to the German forces being able to enter in.
Yeah, they basically just went around the line, attacked them from behind. As I said, France is prepared only for World War I. This tactic would have worked in World War I, and this tactic was mockingly called the Sitzkrieg, which was waiting for Hitler's army. But Hitler had already conquered Denmark and Norway, etc. He was conquering basically all of Europe. So when the Germans attacked the Ardennes forest, they pushed the Allied forces to Dunkirk, and France is basically screwed. But France does manage to rescue hundreds of thousands of troops in Dunkirk. And this was Hitler's first mistake in the war. Can you elaborate, anyone?
During this time at Dunkirk, Hitler decided to bring in the Luftwaffe, which was the Air Force. Because of this, pushed back the armed forces on the ground so that they wouldn't get credit for defeating France. And so because he brought in the Air Force, this gave France and Britain enough time to bring all of their soldiers back home.
Now that Hitler's defeated France and turned part of France into Vichy France, which is basically a puppet state, Hitler now turns to Great Britain. In the Battle of Britain, Hitler used a bunch of terror bombing, which is bombing innocent cities with no military strategic purposes. However, Great Britain's Air Force countered these terror bombings. That Air Force was called the Royal Air Force. However, the Luftwaffe was really powerful and was able to punch through that Royal Air Force and terror bomb the streets of London and other major cities. This period would be known as the Blitz, and it would last for over a month. Great Britain's Royal Air Force, just when they were about to run out of pilots, Hitler started to send his Luftwaffe back to Germany and stop the Blitz on Great Britain. If he had kept the Blitz up, Great Britain may have been forced to surrender, so that was another one of Hitler's blunders.
Soon the U.S. moves into the war because Germany began to gain a lot more power, and that's what the U.S. feared. So with programs like Lend-Lease, the U.S. was able to help supply equipment to Great Britain and the Soviet Union.
And so as many of you know, Pearl Harbor is what officially brought the U.S. into the war on December 7th, 1941. And so the U.S. and Great Britain were arguing over how they should attack the European Axis powers. So they agreed on attacking North Africa first. The Germans were led by Erwin Rommel, who was a mastermind in tank strategy, but the British and the Americans were able to push them back. So next objective was to attack what Winston Churchill called the soft underbelly of Europe, and that was by conquering the island of Sicily and southern Italy. The fighting conditions were really poor. There was trench warfare. It slowed down to a halt. It was brutal, and it was a lot like World War One. So let's go to the Pacific so we don't have to talk about World War One anymore. In the Pacific theater, the U.S. used the island hopping strategy, which meant taking certain islands and creating naval bases out of them, and this would be effective in stopping Japanese supplies. Two important islands for the U.S. to capture were Okinawa and Iwo Jima, and there's also the chain of islands known as the Marianas. On June 6, 1944, D-Day occurred in the Normandy region. Normandy is not a city in France, it is a region, and the beach was divided into 5 parts. Omaha Beach and Gold Beach were the sections where most fighting occurred, and since the US and Great Britain invaded Vichy France, Hitler now has to fight both fronts. Meanwhile, in the eastern front of the Axis powers, Hitler decides to invade Russia in Operation Barbarossa. This would initially be successful until Russian winter hit and the German supply lines were not as effective as they should be against winters like this. There was an important battle in 1942, the Battle of Stalingrad, in which the USSR won the battle at the cost of thousands of men and women. Like the entire city of Stalingrad was trying to survive the German terror bombing. About half the city died, and it lasted about 3 years. So now that D-Day happened, how do you think Stalin would feel about the US and Great Britain finally helping in 1944?
Stalin had been asking for a second front for a really long time. And so this front that the U.S. had promised to be in Normandy, it was promised a long time ago. However, it took a really long time for them to actually start it. And so once they created that second front, they were able to move some of those German forces over there and to remove some of the catastrophe that was happening at Stalingrad and Leningrad.
However, Stalin accuses the US and Great Britain of being really slow to help. So being the paranoid man that he is, he was convinced that they wanted to introduce capitalism to Germany and Russia when those soldiers would be weak from the Battle of Stalingrad, which is, of course, a foreshadowing to the Cold War and the capitalism-communism rivalry. April 1945, Franklin D. Roosevelt, the President of the United States, dies. Harry Truman takes over, which would severely deteriorate the U.S. relationship with Stalin, again, leading up to the Cold War.
Stalin and FDR were originally really good friends, and many thought that if FDR was still alive, he could have prevented the Cold War because of his relationship with Stalin. However, since he died, Truman was a little more harsh on communism than FDR was.
Now remember when I said that more civilians died in the war than soldiers? This would justify World War II being named the War Against Civilians. Of course, we talked about the Battle of Britain, where London was attacked 76 nights in a row, so that was 2 months. Subway tunnels were used as bunkers. And there's the most infamous part of the war, which was the Holocaust, in which German soldiers, also known as goose-steppers, forced Polish Jews into ghettos, and in the Wannsee Conference, 15 men discussed the final solution, also known as the Holocaust, planning it out. The Holocaust was designed by Heinrich Himmler, and concentration camps used boxcars in captured cities to transport Jews to some of the most infamous locations, such as Auschwitz and Dachau. Both Germans and Japanese had a desire for more living space, and they also had a belief of racial superiority to their neighbors. So let's talk more about the Japanese front and how they viewed their country. It's got to be in there somewhere.
The Japanese soldiers really loved their emperor, and they were really passionate about their country, and so many were proud of their emperor that they would become kamikazes, where they would create suicide missions in planes and crash into the enemies, killing themselves as well. And so this just shows the nationalism that the Japanese citizens had, the soldiers.
So this tactic, kamikaze, was heavily used in the battles of Okinawa, where the U.S. invaded the Okinawa Islands, which would become major naval bases in the island hopping strategy. After that battle, all Japanese civilians would fight against the U.S. force. And so almost everyone would be in the war effort. Almost everyone would become soldiers. And remember when Great Britain was terror bombed in the Battle of Britain? They used terror bombing of their own against Germany. The U.S. would also use terror bombing against Germany. Their Air Force bombed Berlin, killing 25,000 civilians. And Great Britain and U.S. team up to bomb Dresden, which would be devastating to the Nazi morale. So the US was preparing for a final assault on Japan. This started with destroying Japanese factories, then destroying Tokyo. There was no Japanese Air Force to counter the US, and many cities were constantly bombed. And then
They then dropped the nuclear bombs, Nagasaki and Hiroshima, which essentially ended all of the conflicts, as Japan couldn't take it anymore, and they realized that they had to give up.
after the war, there are trials. The Nuremberg trials exposed Nazi atrocities and punished those responsible for war crimes. There are similar trials for Japanese war atrocities. One of the most infamous war atrocities from Japan was the Bataan Death March. The story about this is the U.S. surrendered the Bataan Peninsula on April 9th, 1942 to the Japanese. 75,000 Filipinos and American troops were forced to march 65 miles to prison camps, and because of the intense heat and harsh treatment, thousands perished from mistreatment and starvation. There would not be a response to this mistreatment until 2 years later when the U.S. invaded the island of Leyte, recapturing the Bataan Peninsula. So what would be some effects of World War II on the rest of the world?
Well, first, the rest of the world was deeply devastated by it. Much of Europe was completely poor because of the funding from the war, and the U.S. had to make the Marshall Plan to be able to help Europe go back to what it used to be, and a lot of the world had long-term consequences because of the countries that they were allied with, especially if they were communists.
So the question for this video is, who is to blame for the Cold War? There is no definitive answer. There are three main perspectives, and if you have any opinion on who to blame for the Cold War, which country, which nation to blame for the Cold War, leave your answers down in the comments if anyone's watching this video. Hopefully we have more than 0 subscribers. So this has been Harper Cates and my companions right here, and this has been Project E, and I will see you next time.
Which subject are we gonna teach next? Spin the wheel to find out. Next time on Project E!